Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So we're going to start with Cal Bailey, who's Sustainability Director of NG Bailey, which is a construction sector company. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. First of all, a few words about NG Bailey. We are a company who design, install and maintain all the energy systems in buildings. That's the heating system, lighting system, cooling if there is some, electrical power system, the control systems, the data system, the voice network, all these things. So it's the systems that consume energy and the systems which also therefore can be made to perform with less energy. And that's an increasingly large part of our business, I'm pleased to say. We're known in particular in our industry for four things. We try to lead on four things, or I really should say. Apprentice training, we're certainly the largest trainer of apprentices in our sector. Safe construction, low carbon construction, and the energy performance of our own buildings. Pursue those issues, obviously. And I want to talk about five things. Corporations and business, production of energy, consumption of energy, governance, and a brief comment about the church. And I shall try and make some practical and some theological observations if I can. First of all, corporations. Now, I'm one of a small handful of business folk here, and it's easy to feel pretty insecure, pretty isolated by what I've heard so far. We're the cause of consumerism, and we have done some pretty fundamental planetary damage. And I want to say to the NGOs, to the churches, to the academics here, you've awoken us to our terrible plight. Don't desert business now. Our behaviour is appalling. I'll acknowledge that. Most businesses should, even if they won't. But that behaviour is careless, it's not deliberate. What do I mean by that? I mean that, I don't know if you've had the problem sat in these seats, but when someone sits down in front of you and your toes are in the wrong place, they could easily both get broken, your big toes. I know you've done it. And that is actually a safety concern, so let's get that clear. So remove your toes and draw them back when someone sits down in front of you. But when the person in front of you does it, it's going to be careless, not deliberate. Of course it is. And the point is that that's the same in business. Business hasn't deliberately gone out to damage the planet, I don't think. Certainly not in the vast majority of cases. And we don't intend to break things, but we do get it wrong and we do need help getting it right, and I'll be coming back to that. Second point, how do we get change in business? I have been really encouraged in the last, I suppose, 5 years by seeing the corporate responsibility movements in big businesses. Now, I'm not talking about small businesses, I am talking about big ones with brands they're desperate to protect. And those brands are by no means all good. But there is a good side to them, and it has, to my mind, put to death Milton Friedman's belief that the business of business is business. And I think there's nothing done more to destroy that belief for all of us, not just for the businesses themselves, than the evidence that most big brands, and if you take the FTSE 100 companies, the vast majority of those are seriously defensive of their brand. And that gives us a huge opportunity to drive change, and that change is happening, and it's happening at an accelerating pace. I'm not saying it's fast, I'm saying it's accelerating, there's a difference. Thirdly, why doesn't change happen more quickly? There are two simple reasons. The first is that not enough customers are asking for it, and there's a role for the NGOs, for churches, to drive that demand. And secondly, it's that it's too difficult. And there's also a role for NGOs, and what Bill McKibben said, let's drive that change through business, through demanding it and making the difficulty outweighed by the problem of not changing, by the cost of the status quo. Theologically, what is the root problem in business? The root problem in business, to me, is one of purpose. It has lost its purpose. Businesses are fated politically because They create jobs. They are especially fated politically if they not only create jobs but also influence votes. And Ruth called for a resurgence of humility in business. This means recognising that businesses are servants of society and not kings of it. And we have for too long been allowed to pretend that we're kings. We're not. Secondly, I want to come on fairly briefly to the issue of production of energy. I enjoyed Juliet Davenport's presentation. I love the vision of energy which is green, which is local, and which is small in scale. And I think we all get that. I think it's wonderful. And I want to raise three concerns, which I had hoped she was here. I didn't know she was going to be here for this section, but I have raised them with her. She acknowledges them. There is a serious problem in her vision of volatility of supply. Over 60% of the energy in her dream is from wind, mainly offshore, some onshore. And the UK does get wholly becalmed occasionally. And it can happen in winter when we have peak demand. And that is a problem that is pretty difficult to overcome on the scale she's talking about, I think. Second is a planning problem. Small local stuff is suffering severely at the plans at the moment. There's lots of stuff I would like to do on the land that we own, and we can't. And there needs to be some system for compensating local loss of amenity, for example, of visual amenity, with some local benefit. And there is no scheme that I know of remotely to do that at the moment that works. And thirdly, there's a huge problem of cost, which we will refer to in the questions, which I didn't dwell on. Thirdly, consumption of energy. And I want to take the whole demand management system thinking a little stage further. This is something that's core to our business and may be of interest to those of you who have some buildings to manage. There are two problems or two steps one needs to take, very different steps in reducing energy in buildings. One's technical, and we have the technical skill to do that, but there is a second. The technical is not sufficient by itself. There is a behavioural problem, which we have referred to repeatedly this last couple of days, which a year ago was barely being recognised. There is a huge behavioural issue in getting behaviours of occupants of buildings to change. I'll give you the smallest example that requires almost no effort, but it still won't. Turn off their screen when they leave the office. It is saving, I know, 5 watts or something. It is not big, but the effort required is also minuscule. It is right in front of you, and yet people won't do it. If you can get people to change, that across the nation would save, a third of a power station. It's not a precise number, it's something substantial. Secondly, what is government strategy with regard to buildings? I think we all ought to know what this is and understand where it's strong and weak. Government strategy is very, very strong on new buildings. There are all sorts of rules to mean that you can no longer build new buildings that are careless about their energy performance. I'm not saying those rules are good. I personally think they're not, but at least they're a good attempt. In homes, zero carbon homes, whatever zero carbon means, it's not a precise definition of zero. From 2016, you will not be allowed to build new ones unless they're zero carbon, from 2016, and other buildings from 2019. So that's quite a substantial bit of regulation. That regulation is pretty complex, it's expensive to comply with, and it's largely unenforced in the non-domestic sector. But it's there. They've had a go. The problem is, there is almost no strategy for existing buildings. There is not a refurbishment strategy that requires energy performance that's substantially greater than this is now, that's remotely working. And the government's really struggling with that. The Green Deal and the Green Investment Bank are attempts to deal with it, which in my opinion will be pretty unexciting. Fourthly, governance. We're coming to this next, but I want to talk a bit about governance. First of all, what are the major issues of governance that I want to refer to? Well, there's the problem we refer to economic growth versus sustainability. Those two are in conflict, I think. Jobs versus debt. I think those two are in pretty direct conflict in the government's mind at the moment. The problem of planning we refer to, and the problem of behavioural change. To my mind, there is a problem, the root cause of that is with our democracy. And I think we've got to get into big subjects. It's not that democracy in principle is wrong, I'm not anti-democratic, but I do think that the type of democracy we have leads to short-term thinking, and these are long-term problems. And I think when we had, for example, our first past the post system leads the media to focus on the political fight rather than the argument. And I will guarantee that these 3 weeks, we're in the middle of the party conference system, party conference season. The first headline in the news tonight will be David Miliband's speech, and it will be the comment on it will be from who's the commentator? Nick Robinson, who always talks about the fight and not about the fundamental argument behind it. Now, the issue there is that we need, to my mind, something more like a PR system, which means we don't have the oscillation, we have people in government on a more continuous basis because you need coalition, and that will give rise to longer term thinking because the politicians will be more likely to have to face up to the consequences of their own actions. And I think we've got to face big issues like that because our problems demand it. Secondly, the government has a major campaign against red tape because they believe regulation is the enemy of jobs. Now I think we should just straightforwardly say there's a lot of Horlicks being talked about red tape, and thinking back to our debate yesterday on banking regulation, I wonder how many jobs would still be in existence today if we had decent banking regulation 3 years ago. I think our common view probably is quite a few. We might also wish to question how many jobs would have been preserved. We need to think about regulation as a protector of human rights, as a protection against bad behaviour, for example, by business. Regulation is by no means the enemy our government currently makes it out to be. And I want to propose a very small piece of red tape, which will assist our behavioural change in building performance. It's very simple. It is that I'm talking now about big buildings here, and I start with buildings over 1,000 metres squared, so we're talking supermarkets, we're talking corporate head offices. I would absolutely start there with the companies the buildings that are generally occupied by the FTSE 5, FTSE 200, shall we say, is to make them, in reception, it is not to demand a particular energy standard of them. I think that's a mistake. But it is to say, whatever energy performance you have, you must tell us. And it's to demand what's called a DEC, a display energy certificate. There are 2 types of certificates, and it's the one that measures actual occupied energy use of the building that you're currently in. And it's something that looks very like what you see on a fridge freezer in an electrical goods store. And you must tell us in your reception the size of poster that's appropriate to the reception. It could be an A0 size poster in a large reception. You must tell us what the energy performance of this building is. And the great thing about that is the legislative requirement is small. Simply that you must tell us. It's not that you must achieve a grade A. You can achieve a grade G if you wish, provided you tell us what it is. And the beauty of it is that once the requirement is in place to display, the power will be now in the hands of the media. Now, I don't think the media is universally good by any means, but it does have the power to expose the hypocrisy. And what would happen is, they would look carefully in the financial reports of, for example, the banks, and they find that Bank A has said how good it is environmentally and how much effort it puts into high energy performing buildings, low energy consumption. And suddenly, whatever paper you like, Mirror would report on that bank's buildings in Derbyshire. And you discover that the average performance of that bank's buildings in Derbyshire was an E. And yet they've said these wonderful things. Media is superb at exposing hypocrisy, and I think that would be a very, very powerful change. And buildings are 40% of our energy consumption as a nation. And our experience is you can get every building down by 20% with almost no investment. So here is a way of really sharply reducing our demand side curve for energy. Finally, I want to talk about the church. The church has a problem, I think, with its own survival at a local level, and that occupies most of its local efforts. However, the church's vocation, I take it, is to reflect the voice and values of our Creator God. I wonder if the church's fears for its survival have overwhelmed its vocation. There are many Christian business folk who go to church and who have lost their calling to work in God's kingdom because they hear nothing about work at church. Does the church help its members understand what their calling means? It's about integrity and it's about behaviour at work. For example, marketing, and I don't mean that it's purely behavioural at all, as will become clear. Marketing shouldn't be about exploiting our vices and our greed, but about building our vision of the good. That's what marketing has the ability to do. It's a wonderful discipline, but it's been abused. Profit is no more than a necessity for survival in business. That's what profit is. And yet we've built it to be the primary goal. Our primary goal, in fact, is to serve our neighbour's needs in a manner which doesn't damage our neighbour or our world. Very simple. Profit does not calculate this. It's a proxy to which we've given most businesses have given their top priority. And our integrity may just require us to stand up to our employers as Christians in business, even to disagree with them, and just possibly to resign, because we're more committed to our God and His standards than to our income. This is the calling of the Christian in business. Our Master paid a much higher price. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. Well, Cal. Next up is Harfiyah Haleem, who's a trustee of the Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences for the last 8 years. And she's also edited a couple of books, Islam and the Environment and the Muslim Green Guide. So, over to you.
Well, I didn't have much idea about what was meant by the word sustainable production before I started writing this talk. So I looked it up on the internet and I found a few things that clarified the meaning a little bit. The first was a definition: the development, execution and auditing of a business's operating procedures driven by sustainability, performance metrics, cost-saving actions and greenhouse gas reduction goals. Another one is that it's building environmental and social goals into the fabric of enterprise. In short, it means production that doesn't cost the earth. Production without all the evils that attend production in many parts of our economy, such as pollution, slave wages, long distance, air miles, and generally injustice to people and the environment. In Islam, this is represented by the word halal. Halal is and haram. Halal is the permitted and haram is the forbidden. And Muslims are urged to make sure that their livelihoods are halal, are permitted, and they do not transgress all the rules of Islam, including the rules against injustice to other people and to the creation. Laszlo yesterday was talking about right living for Buddhists. Well, halal living livelihoods is a similar concept for Muslims. In the Quran, it stresses the kinship of all the created beings. It says, and that includes all kinds of humans, not just your particular family or your particular race or your country or anything else. And that's always been the case of Islam. It also includes all the wild animals and every creature that moves on the planet, including, somebody said, the birds that fly on 2 wings. They're all part of communities like you. And it says all the creatures that are in the heavens and the earth, everything, not just the creatures, the landscape, the mountains, the trees, everything surrenders to God. And so do many humans. But though many of them, for many of them, punishment is well deserved. So humans are the mavericks of the created world, created universe, because they can disobey God and do things that they shouldn't be doing. So I'm going to tell you about an example. Somebody said just now that that marketing is a way of producing a vision of what could be. Well, I read a book about Islamic civilization a couple of years ago. Everybody knows about Islamic civilization. It took place mostly during what's now called the Dark Ages in Europe. For 1,000 years, this civilization developed human knowledge and sustained and science and technology, and sustained a flourishing global commerce on the basis of wind and water power through mills. And if you look at the history of the Muslim world, the mills were everywhere. Every stream they would calculate how many mills would fit on it, and every hilltop or windy place they would calculate how many windmills they could put on it. And they produced most of the industries that we know today, including ceramics and glass and steel and textiles and paper and food production, and reached a high degree of development using the water, animal, human-powered and animal-powered machinery, and were able to support large populations in villages as well as in cities and towns, from Spain to China. This is even before they had electricity and anybody had discovered how to make electricity or to use it. So what we do now with water and wind power, using electricity that can be generated from it, I'm sure that would be much more efficient than just using wind-powered and water-powered machines with wooden wheels that are really heavy to turn. Income distribution. People were talking about social injustice. Income distribution in Islam is done via the wealth tax called zakat, which Muslims pay if they have above a certain amount of wealth which they haven't used for a year. In addition to that, they're encouraged to give money and all sorts of to all sorts of good causes, and it's all counted as a reward for them in the next world. And the Quran encourages people to give God a good loan. Somebody said, why should people invest if they're not going to get profit? Well, this is the Islamic equivalent of a non-profit investment. You give a good loan to God, and God promises to double it. And you don't harass your debtor. It's not considered as a debt. You allow the debtor plenty of time to pay it back, and as soon as they can comfortably pay it back, then they will pay it back. This works quite well in a lot of places. Whereas usually, as I said yesterday, we'll be blighted, and there are people who give out their money in order to make it grow in the luxurious sense, will lose all the money they had in this world and the next world. And if you look at economies where interest is allowed, well, the money value goes down considerably and the price of things goes up, so you have inflation. Because the money is artificially growing, whereas the real value of things stays the same. And if you use gold to buy a chicken now, it will cost you the same amount of gold as it did 2,000, or at least 1,000 years ago. Money is complete fiction of everyone's imagination. All finance depends on trust. The Quran urges believers to keep their trusts and to keep their word. And it reproves those who say things which they do not do. So people who make promises and do not pay up. Quite a big characteristic of the Muslim world, in my experience. The Quran is very much against that. It calls it kabura maktan, a great wrong in the sight of Allah. Trust is at the basis of global financial system in the Islamic civilization, whereby money could be transferred by letter from one place to another, from one country to another. And the whole banking system, the word bank is an Islamic word, and check is an Islamic word, so the whole thing came from Islam, but it was based on trust. Then they have various business partnerships, which are in Islamic law, whereby you can have direct partnerships on two equal partners, or you can have a sleeping partner who provides the finance and somebody else who does the work. But in every case, no profit, nobody gets a profit unless the business makes a profit, and if it doesn't make a profit or it makes a loss, that has to be shared by all the partners. And there's no chance of getting your money with interest if the business fails. The word risk is also an Islamic word. Risk banking is banking where you have to take a risk in order to make more money. And the word comes from the Arabic word for provision from God, which is rizq, if someone fell on hard times, either they would be helped by other friends or people with more money as a part of their salafah system, or if they have nobody else to help them, the Baitul Mal, which is the state treasury, would help them as well. When the Muslims conquered a country, they didn't despoil it, but allowed its citizens to continue their way of life, demanding only a reasonable rate of tax comparable to the zakat or to pay for the apparatus of state, which includes protection, justice and welfare. That way, production was carried out by citizens without undue centralisation, and the only right the state had was to collect these taxes. Trade was encouraged. In the Quran particularly, it is an essential form of livelihood for people living in the desert where there are no natural resources to speak of. And it was also the livelihood of the Prophet Muhammad himself, these people who trade in those days did not involve spending a lot of carbon on air miles. It was all to do with camels and horses and an elaborate system of stopping places and inns, which they call, I can't remember the name now. So work in the Quran is described as seeking the bounty of Allah. And when people go to the prayers, they have to stop working. And then when the prayer is finished, it tells them to go out and seek the bounty of Allah. But remember remember God much, so that you will prosper. So we have to keep God in mind in everything we do in business, and keep. We have a 5-day prayers, as you probably know, which helps you to keep your consciousness of God alive even when you're busy at work. Now then, I wanted to ask people what they think human beings produce, and what they think people change by their work rather than produce from themselves. There's not much, if you think about it, that a human being produces from their own cells. That is what our brains and our hands make of other things that have been produced. So what is a product? In the Quran, it is God who produces. He produces crops from the earth. It says, do you see this seed which you hold in your hand? Do you make it grow, or do we? That's God. And he has a whole list of things: the water you drink, the fire you make from wood, and all these things. And says, do you do it, or do we? He produces people from their mother's wombs after various stages of development, and he will produce us all from the grave after we die, and takes us to the day of judgment. Natural production in farms and normally what grows on trees, even though in the wild, it takes time. It's not sustainable in the sense that it happens all the time. We can't make it happen all the time. So even if you find apples in the supermarket, that is every day of the year. That is not because it's been produced by trees every day of the year in one place, but they're being imported from other places where they're still growing. And that involves global trade. And we have to think about whose food are we eating. Would they be eating the fruit that we get in the wrong time of the year? And what happens to their environment as a result of our eating the fruit instead of them? And industrial products like fridges and various kinds of chemicals like shampoos and deodorants and everything else, they all come and go according to how companies arise and die off, and finance that comes or fails to come keep them going. But trees go on for many, many decades producing, even if nobody gives them anything to help them. But they do better obviously if you do give them water and food. So Satish Kumar this morning talked about his apple orchard and how lovely it was to have fresh apple juice from his orchard. And on the first day a poem by Milton was featured. So I thought it might be okay to read this very pathetic poem that I've written about the pear tree in my garden as an example of sustainable production. The pear tree in my garden was there before I came. In spring it blossoms, white with hope, spurred on by light and rain. Untimely frosts may harm some flowers, but bees and insects still transfer the pollen to the seeds, so we can eat our fill. All through the summer, lush green leaves turn sunshine into food. Biochemists study how to store it outside the wood. Allah Creator made the sun, the earth, the rain, the snow. The pear tree's roots dig deep to reach the watery food below. By day it soaks up CO2 and gives us air to breathe. Its excess water vaporized makes rain to grow more leaves. It shades us from the summer sun, so keeps the garden cool. And when it rains too much, it holds the flood back in the soil. In August, ripe pears start to fall. They're food for insects first, then slugs and birds and mammals all, and wasps get drunk at last. We humans try to catch our share before it turns to mush. We eat and cook and give away or sell to make some cash. And when it's done, the pear tree's leaves and fruit remains decay, and into the earth from which they came, feed and warm the clay. In autumn winds blow, scattering the dead sticks on the ground, fuel for fires to warm our homes as winter comes around. And decades later, when it dies, the pear tree's life's not done. It gives us wood and logs to burn, fungus and insects feed, and turn the unused wood to loam. Allah creates, sustains, repeats. Let's plant another one. That's all.
Thank you, Harfiyah. Well, the third of this trilogy is Roy Tindle, who's done lots of things, but a lot of them are in the environmental area, a lot of them with Anglican churches and networks in London and various environmental networks. So I'll hand over to you. Have you got a PowerPoint or is that notes?
Yes, thank you. No PowerPoint, so please can you all pay attention? There will be a test later this evening. I'm Roy Tindle. I've been involved in a lot of things. I'm a member of a City of London church, which in itself is quite interesting because churches in a city have a very long engagement with different governments. That's incredibly useful. I'm a member of the steering group of the London Churches Environmental Network, and I have chaired 2 London-wide secular sustainability organisations, all of which is limited importance. But several years ago, I was able to introduce a member of the Labour think tank, Compass, to a fairly new organisation, the Aldersgate Group. Aldersgate was founded 10 years ago by BT, several of the environmental companies, which means the companies that basically shift our waste, and the Environment Agency. And 5 years ago, it was struggling to find members. So Compass, because of the Labour government, was someone they wanted. Somehow, they asked me to become a member, something they would not do today. And I think they regret quite justifiably ever asking me. Nowadays, you've got to be a member of the House of Commons, the House of Lords, or one of the good and the great. And several of the good and the great have joined, but they never turn up for meetings. At least I turn up. Nowadays, we don't trawl for members. Members ask to come to us, and recent members include Microsoft, Bank of America, PepsiCo. We pick up a lot of major international companies, major British companies. Our aim is to have no more than 2 companies from any one sector, and we are an environmental lobbying organisation. We also have several major NGOs, like Friends of the Earth. To join, you sign up to 6 principles, and one of those is about accepting that there needs to be regulation. So it is an organisation that has some conflict with the present government. We're trying to deregulate, and we're arguing for sane regulation. Regulation that is not millions of bits, but is stuck together in a usable form. But for regulation that creates a level playing field so that the good guys force the bad guys to follow and not have the bad guys leading. One of the problems, something we mentioned yesterday, in getting a company to follow right action, they have to be able to carry their shareholders with them. And the minute they start making a loss, boards change. Providing regulation means that a good company can, as I say, force others to follow the right way. Now, I want to start with a couple of very brief stories. One was at a Green Party event several years ago when, at the end of it, someone came up to me and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "You won't know me. I'm Roy Tindle." "Oh," he said, "you're a member of the Sustainable Development Commission's email list, Local Sus UK. I read all your emails. You are an inspiration." I said, "Hang on, you've got it totally wrong. The moderator of the list is over there, the other side of the room. Chris?" "Yes, Roy. What am I on Local Sus UK? Most awkward bastard." He said, "Thank you." Because that's what I suppose, try to be. What I try to do is to call people back to science. And I will mention this in a moment. I'll talk more about it. But now let's talk about how I use that. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, one weekend, I got an email from a lovely lady, whom I've known for several years, who said, "I've just sent off a planning objection for a biofuels plant in the north of England. Here's my objection. By the way, what was I complaining about?" And my response was, wouldn't it be a good idea if you actually checked what you were complaining about? You found out what the company was doing and had a good reason for doing it, rather than knee-jerk. "Well, it's biofuels." I said, "Sorry, that's not enough. You should look at what they're doing." "Oh, I never believe anything a company tells me." Oh dear. I'm privileged. As I say, it was a handful of companies when I joined. I now work with major companies, and I'm absolutely flabbergasted at the way in which there are companies that are driving sustainability forward. There's a lot of reasons, and I don't really mind where they start. Global Business of Biodiversity conference last year, we were addressed first off by the chief executive of Rio Tinto, who said, We're heavily into biodiversity, and I'll tell you why. I'm tired of making enemies. Well, it works. If that gets them doing the right thing, fine by me. KPMG said last year, we're always on the lookout for new business. When we find new business, it's mainly amongst young, new companies that have young executives who tend to be green, and if we're green, we don't get the business. Okay. What is important is how that gets followed up. And that's one thing Aldersgate can do, and that's one thing we can all do, is make sure that when a company makes claims, it stands up to them. I'm not saying that every claim is true, of course they're not. There's a lot of greenwash out there. But I am impressed by people, especially when I find that many of those people I'm working with have young families. And so having got into things like climate change, they suddenly appreciate the risk. Now the beauty of it is that what you get with a major corporate is they'll put scientists to work on it, and they'll find out what the basis is. So they'll start off with a firm basis of understanding, and then worry, and then they want to do something about it. And that's absolutely brilliant. We had a meeting last week at which BT Rep was talking about the need for making consumption far more sustainable. Okay, perhaps that's easy when you're a company that sells services rather than goods, but it's still nice to hear. And I've heard the same thing coming from Unilever in even stronger terms. Companies are trying to change. They've got a long way to go. One thing I did in Aldersgate last year was to introduce biodiversity, ecosystem services. I have a major concern that we tend to look at environmental problems with carbon alone, and that just isn't true. The risks we face in species loss are more immediate and just as worrying. The problems that we may yet have in resource depletion are similarly worrying, and I don't think you can separate them, nor can you separate out injustice. All of these things come together to form sustainability, and if we focus on just one issue, we tend to get the others wrong. So, I had to really remonstrate with this dear lady, and there was one point when she wasn't communicating with me anymore, which she is now. And I think she accepts that in the future she'll look and try and see, and try and at least look at what a company says they're doing. My belief is that we need every ally we can find. And if there are companies that are trying to do the right job, then we work with them. If they don't, then we tell them to go away. Where someone is trying, we support. Now there's another thing that came out of this at a reception for the Green Investment Bank. I was talking to directors of the Bank of America who introduced me to the climate change guy from HSBC. And we got talking about Aldersgate. He said, by the way, what else do you do? And I said, well, I do some work in the Diocese of London. You're an Anglican? Yeah, here's my card. I go to so-and-so church. I've been Anglican. There are Christians out there. And when we name that, we find them. So there's a lot there that can be done. I spoke just now about separating issues. I find it extremely dangerous. One of the dangers that is so current and common is that we all tend to assume that our own area of concern is the only one. And if we put that right, everything else will fall into place. Unfortunately, the problems of sustainability are complex and interlinked. I mentioned getting biodiversity on the agenda at Aldersgate. They had two problems. We started at the first round table about talking about how we could establish a policy, first of all, and try and find from companies what they're doing, and then try and get out, across Europe, a pattern for engaging in biodiversity. And one of our NGO members, and I will not say which, said, but surely we need to look at those species which are economically valuable. And I said, how can you do that then? There is a web of life. Which one do you decide doesn't matter? Because I'll show you where it matters. And then, on a recent report we're about to have published, a phrase, something began with, basically, we all know that carbon is the most significant problem that's been struck out. It's as I say, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but people are trying. Now, there are other problems in sustainability, and I want to talk about those very briefly. They impact on my work, they impact on yours. One of the things I find very difficult is the what I refer to as environmental fundamentalism. I think you all know what I'm talking about. There's areas people are not allowed to question. Go into any group of environmentalists and say, I really like GM, and then duck. Now, here gathered are many scientists. Now, I learned as a scientist that you examine things. You don't just knee-jerk. You look at the issues. And unfortunately, what we've grown up with is an environmental movement that doesn't do that with us. And so good things get thrown out with bad because we don't want to look beyond those preconceptions we have. That is significant to us, I think, because recently on the BBC, there have been a series of programmes basically knocking faith, in particular Christianity. It's the wonderful collection of new militant atheists who have this job of converting the population to their belief system, and it is a belief system. It's not a truth, it is a belief system. And one of the important things that we need to remind them of is that were it not for Christianity and Islam in particular, there wouldn't be any science. We developed it. We developed maths. We played a powerful role, and it's easy to see parallels between science and theology. Critical studies, they both involve. Critical thought. I know that's, some people might be surprised on the fundamentalist wing of the church. But the Christian church, Islam, play a fundamental role, and we need to restore that connection. So, let's look at the other things that I mentioned. Of course it's about inequality, but biodiversity is not just, in fact we're not dealing just with biodiversity in all the scale, we're dealing with ecosystem services, which brings in air and water, and all those other things we depend on. That's where I say it's a complex issue. Resource depletion is arguable, but it's not something I want to discount, just in case those who tell me that copper, for example, is running out are right. We need to make structural changes in how we use materials and make sure that those are reused. We're not doing it. And one other point in this area which really worries me is that even within the Christian community, environmentalism, we base so much of what we do on doom and gloom. I find that hard to countenance because my faith talks about redemption, about a loving God. So what's all this about we're all doomed if we don't do the right things? We need to do the right things, but also we need to change people's ideas by hope. We have had a decade of trying to frighten people into change. What happens when it doesn't work? We shout louder. And I think we need to look again at how we change behaviour. So, to end, I'm sure you're all glad, where do we go from here? I recall being in a DEFRA conference years ago and saying to one of my colleagues who'd organised it, oh, isn't it great being in the annual DEFRA conference where we get together to discuss what we might have been doing were we not in the DEFRA conference? End-to-end, wall-to-wall conferences, which gives us the excuse not to do anything because we're too busy going to conferences to discuss what we might be doing were we not in the conference. There is always that tendency to go out of any conference with a spirit of euphoria and then a couple of days later think, what will change? What move have we made? Now I notice a list has gone round of the Markov. That I think is valuable. And it's something that ought to be used. There are many things we can do together that we can do alone. And I think that we'll find many ideas even from this today. I want to until it hadn't happened. I received an email from a couple of years back from the Natural History Museum about the Year of Biodiversity, asking if I would bring one secular organisation I chaired in, and I did, as a partner. The following Sunday I mentioned it to the parish priest and said, this is something we ought to be doing. He said, do you know who's buried in this church? I said, no. And he took me to one end of the church and was a plaque I now keep in here. It is about a Reformation priest, William Turner, who tried to truly reform the church. But he was also a herbalist, a physician, a botanist, and an ornithologist. He produced the first printed book in the world on birds and the first herbal in the English language. Oh, right. And of course, we also have here Samuel Pepys, one of the first presidents of the Royal Society. What a link with science. So we are doing a biodiversity project. One, because it's significant. Two, because it's not contentious. It's a wonderful way of showing people that small actions, in churchyards, for example, plant a few wildflowers, get a wilderness corner, harvest the seeds and get all the congregation to do the same, and you've made a change. You will make a substantial change, particularly in keeping the pollinating insects alive. We've also got a beehive on the roof. So here are small things, and what we're saying is that going in with this non-contentious issue, because most people in Britain have heard about the plight of the honeybee. They understand it and they'd like to do something. Being as cunning as serpents and as wise as doves. We get them on climate change next. And the beauty of it is that with the support of the City of London, which thus far we've got, there's an opportunity to put in more beehives in the city. Then you go back and say, but where's the forage? Forage? That's easy enough. You plant a green roof. Oh, green roof, how do you do it? I've got a friend at Arab that produces a product. I'll call him. They'll come and see you. Next thing you know, you've got a green roof. The importance of this is not just the green roofs in the city. The importance of this to me is it is a faith group that is making that change, that is pushing that agenda. And I think it demonstrates what we all can do. So I hope somehow, in some way, something will continue beyond the end of this conference, where we do what Bill has been exhorting us to do, and what Fazlun was saying to me last night about engaging with politics and making that change, because if we don't, who will? Thank you.
Okay, well, we've got half an hour to talk around these issues. So somebody's got a microphone, yes, Tim has. So fire away. So let's start up there, and let's take a couple of questions, and we'll answer them in one go.
Morris Mendoza. I just had a question. I work in the area of communications. I'm working recently for a company that's heavily involved in what's known as cradle manufacturing, or circular economy, or closed loop. Relatively rare, I think, in that it's changing all of its systems in order to have pure products that can be recycled endlessly, and aims to do that by 2020. But there are other companies like Kingfisher which are talking seriously about this issue, but they also are stating that it's becoming a bit of a small, cosy club of companies which support this idea, which has been going around for near a decade. But it does seem to solve a lot of problems if it can be done on a wide scale, in the sense that it supports biodiversity, it emulates nature, and it enables us to create products and have a capitalist system that doesn't endlessly take new resources from the earth. And I was just wondering what the panel thinks in terms of that viability as an idea of how much impact it might have.
Thanks. Let's take another comment. Just go ahead. Well, the two of you want to do it. Whichever order. Ladies first.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask about green roofs and how much you know about that and what's being done at the moment with new construction companies and also with existing buildings on green roofs.
Yes, thank you. John Daniels from the Diocese of Hereford. Question for Cal specifically. I think I heard him say when he was reflecting on what Juliet shared with us earlier that he has some question marks about the compatibility of growth and sustainability, and I wonder if you'd like to expand on that a bit, and particularly if he saw any links between that view and what Paul Eakins shared with us yesterday, because again, it seems to me there's a possible area of fruitful debate to be had there.
Thanks. Well, how about green roofs?
Yeah,
Recycling and so on.
green roofs. And work primarily in the City of London, and it's the city's policy that every new building has a green roof. It's quite a forward-looking authority, and it's interesting in that whilst the Houses of Parliament refer to themselves as the mothers of all Parliament, Corporation of the City of London refers itself to as the father of democratic governance. We were there before. And they have this great desire to be at the forefront, so they do tend to pick up and run with things. The other thing I find very useful...
Can you explain what a green roof is? Is it
Yeah.
grass roof or is it
well,
plants?
it can be anything. Basically, the first problem you've got is that you don't want water lying on the roof surface itself. If there's any crack anywhere and you put soil, for example, on the roof, then that crack will be found, and the next thing you'll have things growing on the roof inside, not the outside. So you need something that lifts it off the roof, and it's how you do that. There's a variety of ways of doing it. One of the common things has been putting down a separating layer of gravel and then building on top of that a layer of very poor soil. You want poor soil because basically what you're trying to encourage is native wildflowers that flourish in poor soil conditions, don't need too much water and so on. There was a whole movement of planting sedums which grow nicely but really don't do very much. They don't feed bees, they don't feed invertebrates generally, so don't encourage anything else. So some of the early green roofs which were sedums are now being replaced. Now, I discovered at an exhibition last year that Arup have produced this wonderful product called the Pocket Habitat. It's a Hessian-based bag which is filled with very poor soil and planted with wildflower seeds. And you take it up on the roof, drop it and pull it open. The rain falls, the seeds grow. When the plant dies off at the end of summer, the seeds drop back in the soil and it starts again next year. Now on one of Arup's roofs, they've got a wonderful demo of this with laying bits of old branch across it as well. So you provide pathways for insects to cross. You get insects nesting underneath these things and the spaces between them. And birds appear by the thousands of feet. So it's a very simple way of doing it. I'm not particularly advertising our product. I'm just saying it's a great and easy way of doing it. One of the delights of this is that they produce a very simple substrate, which is a plastic film which lifts the product off. But you can get individual, if the roof's safe, you can get individual members of your staff to go and put one on. It's ownership. So people working there have got ownership of their bag. They're now designing bigger ones which will take rather more substantial plants, hopefully including herbs. Because many herbs flower early and are a wonderful pollen source for bees. So in the city at least, you're getting green roofs planted on every new roof. The difficulty is getting them planted, retrospectively.
You also need a flat roof.
You need a flat. Oh, you can go on quite a gradient.
Or
It doesn't have to be. But the major problem is on traditional planting, you've got to put up a tower crane, and that means blocking the road. It's a fortune. That's why I like this thing. People can carry up.
What about the Back of England building?
Well, the message is spreading slowly. As I say, new buildings all happen. What we're trying to do is persuade others to retrofit. And that's a one-by-one and slow process. We're getting there.
Cal, do you want to address any of the issues, but including one?
Sure, I mean, green roofs are great if you've
been on one and then enjoy it. But the latest thing I've been asked to create for someone is a green wall. And this is for a big development near King's Cross, and they've been asked to do green walls, and no idea what that means, and it's equal front, clearly not flat. The cradle to cradle, it just seems to be
Isn't it called a hedge? Hedge funds. Hedge funds, it's all right.
Cradle to cradle manufacturing is just absolutely good manufacturing for all the reasons that I think we would applaud. I have no special knowledge about it at all. But it's just self-evident the right way to do it. And the question is it genuinely cradle to cradle, which fits or not? And the question about growth and sustainability, I'm no expert in that. It just seems to me that business has driven the agenda for growth for years, and why should business be driving the agenda? There's many other agendas and many better voices to be driving it, it seems to me, but I have no special knowledge of what, in relation to Paul. It seems to me where he was coming from was pretty sensible, provided there genuinely is this kind of distinct thing between the physical world and the economic world, which I must say I question. We can't have endless growth in the physical sense, as we would usually say.
Harfiyah, do you want to add anything?
I was going to say something about RSA meeting I went to last week, I think it was. Well, there's an article in the Harvard Business Review. It's the editor of the Harvard Business Review and his producer who was speaking at the RSA. And there's an article in the Harvard Business Review, which I read while I was there, about businesses in China trying to make profits and get contracts against the background of bribery and corruption, which entrenched in the culture there. Yes, they were saying that the principles, you can stick to your principles, it's a good thing if you stick to your principles, because you get better business as a result of it, even though you might lose some other contracts with corrupt companies. And that they should consult with the Chinese and talk to them and communicate with them properly so that they understand why you've got these principles. So these would be people, one of the principles they were pushing was the sustainability agenda. And I spoke to the editor and he said that business is not really, in his talk he said that business is not really ready for sustainability. And if you talk to the younger business directors and managers, they were more interested, but the older ones weren't. So I said, don't give up. You have to keep on with all the managers, even if they're not ready. This is the most important thing you have to teach them, basically.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah, here, Peter. Right, just use this.
From the Geological Survey of Finland, my adult life has been transforming the fact between Australia and Finland, which give two very different perspectives on development of society and priorities. But I'm mostly involved in, as a geologist, in mineral exploration. Particular work is actually publicly funded. So, the Geological Survey. It's a continual dilemma. I have no solution, so this is more of a plea about, it's the whole concept of sustainability with respect to depletable earth resources. Is it a nonsense, or can we really find a compromise which allows us to respect the whole global community? And what Roy was saying, I would certainly endorse that over the past 10 to 15 years conversation with many people in the mining industry, that they have become aware and implemented practices that would be promoting community involvement, respect for communities and environmental sustainability. This is just a plea that I would like much more discussion on this area and a deeper understanding of it, because it's very, very significant in terms of the operation of global companies. And also, I'll have the example I would give in Finland, where discovery of mineral resources leading to mines in communities which have been very displaced by globalization in the paper and forestry industry, previously mentioned. So there are definitely local benefits as well that over a few decades, which are important. So this is something that it's more of a general question. I'm sorry that this has become a bit of a random commentary. This is something I see, it's this interface of also justice as well as sustainability. These are intertwined and very, very important.
Justice and sustainability of scarce resources, I guess. Because one thing that happens when you use up a resource, it just gets more and more expensive, which actually sometimes leads to people finding other resources, other minerals that work just as well. Does anybody have comments on this?
Yeah, a lot of I think one of the things we need to take into account is what you're suggesting is the environmental damage that's done by more mining activities. As minerals become scarcer, we do find new sources, but they're very often buried under mountains, for example, that we see in the US, where mountains are just removed to mine what is underneath. I really did enjoy reading about US uranium extraction, pumping acids down into the strata in which the uranium ores are, and then pumping most of that acid back up again. Of course, some of it gets in the water table. You can tell where it is because the local communities glow in the dark. Uranium is not something I particularly want to consume in my drinking water. So there are major problems, but I think the thing that we do need to take account of is that we live on a finite planet. Not only are we on a finite planet, but we can only mine the skin of that planet. And the process by which that skin is renewed is slow. So if we use things up and they're gone, we have a problem. It's really partly about what was being suggested up there, I think, in industrial symbiosis. It's waste materials of one company going on to another, but it's also about reworking. I was talking to a guy from BT the other day about all the replacement they're doing of copper with fibre optic. And I said, you need to get that dug up quickly. He said, don't we just? It's being dug up before we get there. There's a tendency to think that the stuff we've stuck underground can stay there. We can't afford that.
That's my question from up here. And then right at the back.
Just not so much a question as a contribution on that question. It happens I'm a mine and environmental engineer by background, and the question of sustainability in the mine industry is something I've worked on a lot. And you know, I think that in the long term, the fundamental issue is that we're going to have to get to where most commodities are recycled, which is what Roy was saying before. We've got some very poor practices at the minute. Ironically, quite a few of them derived from you know, well-intentioned environmental concerns. The one I would immediately think of in that category is platinum. For the, you know, in the catalytic converters that we all have on our cars, we've been using platinum merrily now for years, which converts carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide, which is less of a problem for human health, but we all know it's not brilliant for the atmosphere either. But a fundamental problem is we're scattering fine-grained platinum dust in all the road dust of the world, and it's washing down the gully pots and off into streams in irrecoverably small quantities. And platinum's one of these commodities that most reserve estimates give it about 10 years to run, you know, in terms of primary reserves. So, you know, that's only one, and well-intentioned, but it's being used in a way that doesn't allow it to be recaptured and recycled, and this sort of behaviour we need to really deal with. But just to sort of back up what Roy was saying, that he was flabbergasted that some of these big corporates do take this stuff seriously. I've done a lot of work on this around the world, and I was similarly flabbergasted. It's a while ago now. 1997 was the first time I was flabbergasted. Out in Peru, where the big mining companies were all behaving amazingly responsibly in a time when there was no environmental regulation. They were all living up to what they would have to do at home in North America or Europe or whatever, despite the Brazilian government at the time not asking them to. And the small local artisanal mines were the problem, polluting out of all proportion to the size of their operations. That's still the case in much of Latin America and Africa and Asia. But a particular experience that brought home to me how serious the big corporates are was when I was working with WWF in Europe on the European Mine Waste Directive in all of the discussions and so on. And I was obviously, we were the only NGO allowed in actually, and allowed in on the grounds that we were a university, blah, blah, blah. And I was making a case for the Mine Waste Directive. There's a whole bunch of German companies that didn't want to hear about it. It's a classic thing, sort of small local companies want their right to pollute. And eventually I got this big sort of voices of support from the back of the room. It turned out to be Rio Tinto. Now when I was a student I had a badge that said RTZ out, you know. And I went up to the guy and said, well, thanks very much for the support. And I said, since when are you lot on this agenda? And he said, oh, it's simple, mate. He said, it's about 3 or 4 years ago. He said, we decided we wanted to continue to be a mining company for the foreseeable future. And if we had to get serious about this issue, well, we're not going to be a mining company for the foreseeable future. So, it's enlightened self-interest. I don't mind, particularly if it's self-interest as long as it's truly enlightened, I suppose. I mean, I'd rather it came from truly, altruistic grounds, but nevertheless, if it gets us in the right direction. So I think there are grounds for hope, but in terms of, the nonsense that colleague from Finland raised there, is it fundamentally impossible to talk about sustainability in mining? The only formulation I've heard of that works is if the mining activity results, because obviously once the ore body's used, it's used, but if the mining activity results in some net social and preferably also environmental improvement for the long term, then the short term use, you can make a rational case for it. I mean, whatever we don't grow, we've got to mine. I mean, that's true, but there's lots of ore bodies should be left in the ground. But if it can make a net improvement, then it can be justified. Now, I've gone on too long, but if anybody's interested in that topic, I'll happily talk to the case from you.
Yes. Interestingly, there was an article, we'll get to the back in a minute, there was an article at the weekend that the City of London is going to start using the dust swept up from the streets to recover rare earths like neodymium. They didn't mention platinum, but it said there are other things too. Neodymium is also used in catalytic converters as well as in your mobile phones and so on. So, there are serious efforts to recycle things, aren't there? Anyway, another point or questions?
Thank you. Phil Kingston. A conference has to be organised in some way, the themes and the topics, and I'm very much appreciating what's happened here. The little difficult I'm having at the moment is we're on a session about production, and I want to link it to consumption because they seem to me quite inseparable. People get paid for producing, and then we do things with the money. And it's the doing things with the money that is bothering me a lot. And I want to just comment a little bit about fish. There's a NEF study which shows that we in the EU, within 6 months, we use the annual quota of fish from EU waters. That means for the next 6 months we're eating fish from other waters, and because almost all the fishing grounds in the world are either fully exploited or overexploited, we are eating other people's fish. And when we take the West African fish producers, fish catchers, they are being put out of business. They are not eating their families are not eating the staple diet that they've had for generations. These are having huge effects, and eventually, because I gather that studies are indicating that by 2050 or before, all of the world's fishing grounds will be commercially non-viable. Our grandchildren will not be eating fish. And this seems to me a madness. I cannot believe that we are heading down a road where our grandchildren do not eat fish, along with a whole lot of other products. So I just want to link it to production, and I want to say one more thing. About 60 years ago, I stood on a beach near Cardiff, and I saw the wonderful sight of about 40 porpoises leaping out of the water. That's right there in my head at the moment. And I grieve that my grandchildren and my children will never see it. So these losses of the gift of creation and the losses of resources, I just want to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another comment down front here. Take two more. Oh, is that one person do that?
Really. I was fascinated by the way in which you thought we might tackle a non-regulatory government, a government that's fear of regulations because regulations are the enemy, by suggesting a really minimal and I think quite attractive regulation. The idea that the big buildings over 1,000 metres will be obliged to display their energy performance. I can see enormous advantages of this. Two questions really. How do we do it? How do we actually get the government to actually produce the regulation that makes that work? And secondly, what would happen then if we did manage to do this and this building's reduction was in fact 20%? What would your next step be to get it done even further?
And a last comment, and then that's the panel for this one.
Mine was a question to the panel. Over the last 40 years, all sorts of jobs and industry sectors that were familiar to me as a child have disappeared. Over the next 40 years, you might hope that all sorts of other industry sectors and jobs will disappear in the interest of sustainability. So I would like to ask the panel if they would choose which industry sector and job they would most like to see disappear, and what they would say to the CEO of that company to persuade them to diversify into something more useful.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to go first on the comments? Karen, do you want to?
Okay, sure. Let me take your question, Elaine. Right. This idea of putting decks in every reception of major buildings is an idea that a number of us have had, and happens to be a particular expert in it here because he has been part of creating the existing legislation that we have with the DC, with the Department of Communities and Local Government. So you may be very well placed to answer this yourself, Ant, at the moment. But there has been some campaigning. There are a number of businesses that support this idea. We led a campaign that got a number of very well-known brands to support it, including several construction companies, several banks, several, M&S was the biggest retailer we got, and some serious names came and joined this. And we went to government and we had to persuade, we thought, 4 government departments. DCLG were already there, largely. DEC didn't take too much persuasion, DEFRA didn't take too much persuasion, BIS was a really hard one, and it took quite some time, but we did win them around by about June. And I was explaining to one or two people over the break, I think this morning, that the issue was whether this became a part of the third reading of the energy bill, which came to Parliament, I think it was 3 Mondays ago now. And we learned the previous week that Treasury suddenly decided, we heard something about Treasury earlier on, that they were going to veto it. So we had a major letter writing campaign to George Osborne, which many, many companies joined in, and under the guise that it was extra legislation, he rejected it. So it hasn't become part of the third reading of the energy bill. And we'd even told him that they have a one-in, one-out policy. We told him there was a one-out that we would give him extremely easily. It was also a label that has to go in every reception of every building, which we regard as wholly pointless. It's the label that has, it's the no smoking sign. In every building there's got to be a no smoking sign. Now for the first 2 weeks when that became law, you may have needed a label. But there is no way on earth you need that label now, because if I was to light up in this room, all of you would jump on me and say, oh, okay, go outside. It's just unnecessary to have a label. So we'll simply offer a one in, one out. So that's what's happened with the legislation. We've got and the single biggest victory, I suppose, was getting the British Property Federation to support it. Their chief exec is a superb woman called Liz Peace, who gets the big picture, even though many of the member organisations don't, but she's happy to take a stance on this. What would happen if this was to take place? Well, the reason we're proposing it is that something like it has already happened and has already had a very dramatic effect on the energy consumption of our homes. And this is the rule in 1990 that came in from the EU that white goods had to be labelled. Now, you will all have seen that very simple energy label on which all building energy labels are fundamentally based. And that's been in since 1990, and I have the stats as to what happens to what we, the consumer, bought in the UK since 1990. To be long story short, we all started buying A-rated goods. They cost more, but we all started buying them. Such that before 1990, 80% of what we bought was rated C and below, and after 1990, 90% of what we bought was B and above. So just a complete change of what was bought, and by the way, there were several tightenings of legislation, such that what was an what was an A before would now be something like a D or a C. In other words, severe improvements, all driven by the consumer. No one was made to buy an A, we chose to. And I think the same would happen over a longer time period of building. So I think it would be very dramatic legislation indeed. Very, very light touch legislation, absolutely in line with the liberal philosophy of the Conservative Party. I mean, excellent legislation, most people believe.
Can I ask whether the energy gradings of buildings you put up for sale now, domestic buildings, has had any impact?
On domestic buildings, there's very little evidence it's had an impact.
Because there has to be a lot
very
of
unpopular.
every sale.
And this is why I'm suggesting we start with big branded businesses, because they are very protective of their brands. They want their brands to be seen to be good. You know, think of retailers, think of the big products of people like Unilever. And if we associate their product with energy carelessness or with all sorts of negative influence, they will defend these brands, as you well know. And to do this in their own headquarters and to run the risk of the newspapers saying you say this but you do that is a really powerful way of driving business change in my view. Easily the most powerful, much, much better than government regulation because it's hand-handed as legislation. It's big fist and always misses the right target, to me.
When's the next opportunity to put that through, and the legislation for that? When's the next one?
Yeah, I don't know exactly the timing, but the government is in theory committed to that legislation now. They've said they'll do it, and they haven't had no time. But in terms of sectors to eliminate, I could have all sorts of fun on this. I mean, casinos. That's the law of death. I would just close it down straight away. They are a social evil, it seems to me.
And the lottery.
It's a lottery, absolutely.
The new one opening.
But let's have some fun with other sectors.
Certainly run casinos, why they didn't build those new great super casinos they were planning to build.
There is one being built now in Birmingham. It's just got planning permission and they're out for tender at the moment and we're not going to build it.
Arming industry.
Sorry?
Arming industry.
The arms industry.
Well, BAE have just today announced firing 2,000 people, so it's happening by default. Anything you would ban?
I don't know about banning, but I mentioned earlier, suddenly out of the blue, Siemens, one of the major international electrical and electronics firms, said, we're not going to construct any more nuclear power plants. And we're going to go to Russia and say, sorry, we're unable to go ahead with the contracts we've agreed, which means paying them. And you think, wow. And this is something about public opinion about nuclear in Germany. Now, whether you agree with nuclear or not, it is the point that public opinion has actually changed a major company. Now, also, in recent days, Scottish and Southern have similarly said they are going to not build any more nuclear plant, but they're going to spend the money on renewables. So in this country too, opinion can be changed. You can get companies changed. I go back to what Carol says, and it's that lovely line from Rio Tinto. We're tired of making enemies. The media does affect people. There are more people who are environmentally aware, and that can cause companies to change what they do. I think if you want a list of what I've changed, I'm sorry, I wasn't given 4 hours, otherwise I'd stay here and give it to you.
Just one, will do.
Well, the arms industry.
The arms industry, right, thank you. Let's have another couple of questions, then we have to stop. I think a lot of us feel that it's very strange that we sell offensive weapons to other people.
And to Carl, just to follow up what we've just been talking about, could your organisation encourage a voluntary code so that you could say, not wait for legislation, let's put the signs up and shame all others to do the same?
You can answer that, yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. And the campaign we led, which I described, which had about 40 major respondents, every one of them committed by the end of this year, December this year, to have voluntary debts in their receptions, and none of them was compulsory.
Okay, well done. Any last questions before we stop? Jonathan's question. Is there somebody right at that?
I'm Jonathan with Whitworth University. I'm just curious, based on this recent conversation, if Cal, you or others would want to dispute some of the things Bill McKibben was saying this morning about the danger of big companies. You're suggesting that actually larger companies sometimes have more reason to protect their brand. Does that qualify some of the things we heard this morning, or I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that?
Was there one right at the back somewhere that's been waiting for ages? Yes, sorry. And then this must be the last one.
Chris Harwell from Preston in Lancashire. Thanks for mentioning British Aerospace. I have 4 members in my congregation who work for British Aerospace. It's a major employer in the area. And it's one thing to actually fire them, and we don't like the work that they're in. But at the moment, there's no connect in providing anything worthwhile for them to be doing afterwards.
I'll ask a question from everybody else. I'll comment. Okay, just a very brief one then, because we've got 2 minutes.
Very briefly, with regards to mining, it's worth being aware of an idea called the natural step, which came out of Swedish scientific research and has a long history of engaging with business and young authorities and forming the future, which was called the British. Basically, to summarise, one of their principles is you don't extract out of the Earth's crust. As a long-term aim for
you don't extract anything.
As a long-term aim for sustainability, that's one of their key principles.
We could debate whether a society could work on that. Okay, let's have the panel just give final thoughts then.
Well, to come back on the Bill McKibben point, it's him I was responding to in some of the comments I made. I agree with Bill wholeheartedly in lots and lots of areas. And what businesses sometimes do is outrageous and should be, well, I suggested 2 ways of helping business to change. One is to get customers to ask for something else. So why don't we have organised campaigns more against certain business brands or against certain businesses themselves? And secondly, to make such issues for business by determining to develop tar sands, for example, the difficulties they have in not doing it, in other words, maintaining the status quo, become smaller than the difficulties they have by doing it. So they want to retain the rest of Shell, so they can't do this. That kind of activity, I support that strongly, and write letters constantly on that basis. However, where I disagree with Bill is, I thought his answer to the question about what do you say to the person in Shell who's a Christian who is staying within Shell, his answer was, you should wake up and get out of Shell. You should, flee the devilish empire, frankly, is what you said, and I disagree with that wholeheartedly. The folk in Shell are not unaware of the problems they've got. What they have is a huge dilemma between satisfying shareholders and damaging the planet. Very simple, I'm sure it's a lot more complex than that. And we have to, if you're within Shell, there is a role to play to bat for the kingdom as well as for Shell. And where that conflicts, it seems to me a Christian has an extremely clear priority, and that's what I was saying at the end. And the church needs to help those Christians understand their role, and the church is largely failing to do that. In fact, I see the church doing that incredibly little. I have felt church for me for the last 30 years has been an experience of wanting me there for my checkbook. and possibly, at their best, also wanting me to bring a few business pagans with me. It has absolutely failed to support me as a businessman until this last couple of years. And that is just unacceptable, that business is so concerned about its own survival, having more people and more money, that it, frankly, I think it leaves Christians to drown.
Harfiyah, do you want to have any last comments?
I was going to say something. I think it's important to work with businesses. With businesses as well. I'd like to see more environmentalists and people of conscience working with businesses to improve their ethics. And I hope that magazines like Harvard Business Review as well will continue to try and improve the ethics of businesses.
Thank you. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, big companies. I think there's a difference of scale in Britain and the US. We haven't got companies that are quite so pernicious in this country. Looking at fossil fuel money going into fighting any climate change effect on government. We don't. If it does, it doesn't work here. We have government.
Oh, that's lobby. The lobby is not.
Oh, the lobby's there, but it's not quite as pernicious, and there's not putting the millions in that gets put in the US. British Aerospace, I appreciate the problem. My response is, I'm no saint, but I've walked out of 3 jobs that I found unacceptable. And I suffered economically because of it, but I felt better because I was not working for a bunch of unpleasant people doing things I couldn't support. Not extracting, well, one day we'd have to stop extracting because, as I said, the geological process is rather slow. So when we run out of something, the first thing we're going to see is what has been referred to as urban mining. That's going and looking, seeing what's locked away in urban communities. The second thing is buy a landfill now.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panel and to all of you for a very long day.